Welcome to the Better Questions podcast. In today's episode, we're talking about faith and science. The ever dreaded topic that no one really wants to talk about in the church, but it's a conversation that needs to be had. So we talked with Dr. Andrew Root today.
We got a much smarter Andrew to weigh in on this.
Much smarter Andrew.
Dr. Andrew Root is the Carrie Olson Balson Professor of Youth and Family Ministry at Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota. And he recently wrote an amazing book that I've read. It's called Exploding Stars, Dead Dinosaurs, and Zombies, Youth Ministry in the Age of Science. But it's a book that's all about how we begin to approach this topic of science within the church. He focuses specifically on a youth ministry context, but it's got stuff that's relevant to all areas of the church. And man, this is an amazing conversation.
Yeah, it was really good. And this has always been my favorite subject to study, science, and specifically even like chemistry, and life science and physics. And so just hearing his perspective on how we can approach not even simply reconciling science with faith, but how we can go deeper and really get specific on how we can shore up a specific scientific study with a specific experience with our personal God. So it was just such a helpful reframing for me, and just really exciting to talk with somebody that's done scientific work professionally.
Yeah, and if you're new to this podcast and you don't know what our goal ultimately is, or if you're someone who lands very strongly on one side of evolution or creationism, we just want you to know that the goal of this conversation is to find healthy and unifying ways of having the conversation. And so what you'll find is a conversation about how to remove assumptions and biases and define how the Bible reads us and how the scriptures lead us to action, and not necessarily about arguing one way or the other. So we hope that whoever is listening, you just be open to this conversation.
So here is our conversation with Dr. Andrew Root.
Well, we're here today with Dr. Andrew Root. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, it's great to be with you guys. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, would you just take a second to introduce yourself to our listeners, let them know a little bit about who you are?
That's always a very dangerous thing to have to introduce yourself to a bunch of people, because you can either undersell yourself or be incredibly a presumptuous a-hole. So I'll try to avoid both those things. But I live in the Twin Cities. I teach at a school called Luther Seminary, which I've taught at for 14 years about now. So it's been a while, and I tend to write and research around broad topics of ministry, but focus a lot on youth ministry, but also a lot about pastoral ministry, and kind of see myself as a practical theologian. But do a lot of just dialogue with a lot of theological questions as well. So
awesome. Well, I know one of the more recent books you've written is called Exploding Stars, Dead Dinosaurs, and Zombies, Youth Ministry in the Age of Science, which I just read recently. And I know even though you kind of wrote that book through a youth ministry lens, I think it applies to all areas of church ministry. And I'm just curious what inspired you to write that book and to focus on that particular topic.
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. The reason I wrote that book particularly is we had a grant, a John Templeton Foundation grant that was it's a very unsexy name. It's actually a terrible name. It was called Science for Youth Ministry. So I don't know if we had too much to drink or not enough to drink when we came up with the title of that grant, but that's what it was called. And so when you write a grant, you have all these grandiose ideas of what you're going to do, and you start writing things things like, yeah, if you give us the money, we're going to do this and we're going to do that and we're going to change this and we're going to change that. And one of the things we said we were going to do is we were going to write a book on faith and science particularly for youth workers, but for pastors. And then I had to write it. So that's what kind of led me to write it. But why I got interested in the topic of faith and science to begin with is because I think central to my own work has been thinking about how, particularly in a secular age, particularly in the kind of cultural context we live in now, how hard it is as a pastor and minister to try to point people to even give people an imagination for what I call divine action or for the living presence of God in their lives. And science seems to be a roadblock for some people when it comes to thinking about a personal God in the universe that they could pray to and who could answer their prayers. Big questions of being a scientifically rational person will come up, or just a kind of mature person who could possibly believe in these ancient stories and yet, believe in the Big Bang or something. So that's what led me into the topic, and I tried to wrestle with those questions really through the practice of ministry.
Awesome. I'm involved in youth ministry as well, and I remember not too long ago I did this social media response question with our students, and one of the questions I asked them was, why don't your friends believe in God? And one of the responses that I got that I thought was really interesting, the students said, my friends don't believe in God because they believe in science. And I'm just curious, why do you think so many people have this view that these two things, faith and science, are contradictory to each other?
Yeah, I tried to really delve into that in the first part of the book and try to make an argument for that well, I guess an interpretation on why I think that happens. And at one level, I think a lot of the stuff you read about faith and science, a lot of the stuff that's out there in academia, can be really helpful for someone on the ground working in ministry. But in some ways, it isn't helpful because you can actually do a lot of philosophical work with what is theology and what is science and what are the areas where they interact. But when you're a youth worker or you're a pastor and someone comes up to you and just asks a question like, well, how can I believe God is good? And we know that, evolutionary theory says that everything dies and that there's mass extinctions. How could there be a good God and be mass extinctions? As a pastor, you're thrust into that existential question. And that becomes a big question where if you're just a theologian in an academic institution having a conference, you can kind of stay at more of the philosophical level. But when it comes directly to your question of why young people tend to believe that, I think it's because when we hear the word science, we're not really sure what we're talking about. And often when we hear the word science, I think particularly, we did some research before I did this book, and when we would talk to youth workers particularly and pastors, when they heard science, they thought of something like, at its most hardcore, like Richard Dawkins, the New Atheists, talking about how religion is a mental illness or something. Or on maybe the soft side of that is Neil deGrasse Tyson in the show Cosmos, where I like Neil deGrasse Tyson. I mean, my running joke is that I think all of America has to like Neil deGrasse Tyson because Stephen Colbert likes Neil deGrasse Tyson, like they're friends. So I think it's a law that because Stephen Colbert is a American treasure, we have to like whoever Stephen Colbert likes. But Neil deGrasse Tyson tends to kind of slide into this kind of sense of science tells us everything. And if you're the kind of person who, he would never say it like this, but he insinuates, if you're dumb enough to have to believe that there are religious answers to questions in the world, then that's too bad. But we already know that science has told us everything we need to know. And if we just keep following science, we'll solve every problem there is. And so I think when young people say that, what they hear is science as this thing, that you either have to choose this kind of worldview where everything is natural and material, there's no mysteries in the world, or if there are any mysteries, they're just puzzles that are yet to be solved. And then a more kind of religious framework that says actually there are mysteries within the universe and within our own spirit that there are no answers to, that there's some parts of life that there just simply are no simple answers to. And I think actual real scientific work, say that scientists actually do, is not as reductive as the Neil deGrasse Tyson perspective. But we're not really sure what we're putting in conversation when we say science. And I think we get confused all the time. We're like, science and faith are in conflict. It's because we think of those who are making a claim that science is a religion, and then those who believe in some kind of religious spiritual perspective. Those things are in conflict. But when it actually comes to, say, the theory construction of evolution or the theory construction of cosmology, I don't think there's as much of a conflict as we tend to think there is. That there's actually ways that those open up to all sorts of questions of mystery and being and things like that. So I think that's why young people do that. They think that there is a conflict, and the media plays out there's a conflict, and too often their pastors play out that there's this conflict. But we haven't really gotten clear on what we mean by science.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think most of us here would probably agree that that faith and science aren't as much at odds as most people think they are. But I just wanted to ask, and maybe this question is too related to what you just said, so if it is, I apologize. But I often personally tend to think a lot about how can I reconcile faith and science. And in fact, I ask that question a lot, like, how do I reconcile my faith with science? But here at the Better Questions podcast, we sometimes acknowledge that some questions might be more misguided than other questions, and there could be better questions we could be asking. And so I'm wondering from you, is there a better question we can ask than, how do I reconcile faith and science? Like, is that question misguided? And if so, why?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really nice way of putting it. I think in some senses it can be misguided. I mean, it can be misguided because we're confused on what we're actually asking, like how does science and faith relate, or even like how does science and religion relate? Like those are really, science and religion are two pretty artificial categories. Like there's no one has a religion. You know what I mean? Like religion is a generic category. People have particular expressions and practices inside a larger category we call religion. Like, you just like Muslims and Buddhists are very different folks. They're both categorized in religion, but to really understand something significant about their practice, you actually have to participate in their practice. You actually have to get close to it. You can't just stand outside of it and say, well, that's all religion. And I think it works similarly with science. You can't just say, well, all science believes this. That one of the analogies I tend to use is that science really is just a big room of a bunch of people talking and having all sorts of different conversations. And to really figure out any coherence in that, you have to go in and have a conversation. I mean, the physicists are in one corner having a conversation, the biologists are in another, chemists are somewhere else. Social scientists don't know if they should be in the room or not. Like there's all sorts of things going on. So one of the things I try to tell people, especially as they think about this in the context of ministry, is that you should never do like a retreat on religion and science. That is absolutely boring. There's probably one person every 10 years who would be interested in that, and some philosophical kid or adult who no one likes to talk to anyhow.
Like us?
Like you guys. You were the one that no one wants to talk to at a retreat. Yeah. No, but you could have a really interesting conversation on thinking about like prayer and research on like neurological conditions in the brain during meditative periods. So there's been all this research done. Like that all of a sudden becomes really interesting. So taking a specific science and a specific like practice of faith becomes really interesting. So I think where it becomes a bad question, to get back to your good question, is that it becomes bad when we work in too big of generalizations. So like asking a question like, well, what do we know? Where do we pray for healing, and where do we trust God to heal? Or how has the biblical text understood healing, and how do we understand healing, now that our church is right next to the Mayo Clinic? Like that becomes really an interesting conversation. What does it mean to be healed? Or what does it mean, what does it mean for God to like interact with us and answer prayers? Like I've mentioned a few times, like that becomes a much more interesting conversation than just as, well, is faith and science in conflict? Is religion open to science? Is science open to religion? So I think the more specific you get, the more that it becomes quite an interesting conversation.
Right. This is a personal topic for me, just because growing up, I had the weird combination of a interest in the Bible and an interest in science, which neither of those make you very popular. So when you start mixing them, it becomes like a personal thing to you, because you're not just at the playground talking about science or the Bible. And, I acted out my frustrations with the evil science teachers at my school in many weird ways that I would like to leave in the past. But a lot of it stemmed from, it was a bad idea to be like a young kid, like Googling this stuff and just listening to anyone who spoke on the topic. And it seemed like the root cause was I was trying to find how the Bible spoke about science. And I would just like to know from your perspective, is that even a worthwhile goal? Like, can we even look to the Bible to speak on science?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, this will be the total like academic cop-out answer to this really important question. But in some ways, I don't think we can, and in other ways, I think we have to allow it to. In other words, I think the Bible does have something to say about what it means to live a human life, what it means to seek for the sense of the good or the encounter with God, and that all I think matters to making sense of our human life. But I don't think we can turn the Bible into a science book and say, well, I mean, the Bible says that Joshua, when Joshua was in the middle of his battle, that the sun moved. So clearly, like these are arguments that Galileo had problems with in his time. Like, well, the Bible says the sun moved, not that the earth moved. So therefore, I think if you try to make the Bible be a scientific book, you're in big trouble. And I don't think that undercuts its importance or even its authority. I think that the Bible speaks very, very trustworthy on who God is and how God acts. And so that does tell us something about what the human story is. So I don't think we can, I also don't want to keep those things completely separate. I guess I'm one that wants to see us to have dialogue between those things. And so some of the claims that the Bible makes about what it means to live a human life, I think can, especially to some science, like say certain cognitive sciences and things like that, there should be a point of conversation. But if we expect the Bible to say anything about physics or anything about biology, I think we're asking the Bible to do something that it's not intended to do. That it's really trying to tell us the story of Israel's encounter with this God and who this Jesus Christ is that is born, lives, dies, and is risen again. Like, that's what the Bible really is ultimately up to. But it does make certain claims, like this Jesus of Nazareth was dead and lives again. And and that does come up against certain claims of science, which is, like to quote the old Lost line, dead is dead. Like, no one comes back from that. So those do put us in some kind of conflict. So I think it would be unfair to our people to be like, well, no, if you do it right, there's no conflict between faith and science. No, there's certain conflicts here, like dead equals dead, or no, there was a human being who was the fullness of God, which we don't know how that works, who came back from the dead. Those are kind of levels of conflict, but they're also very similar to just narratives and discourse. That as human beings, we always need stories to make sense of our lives. And there's ways that science gives us stories that can be helpful, that can be informative, and there's ways that the biblical text as well as the theological tradition gives us stories. And we're always these kind of hermeneutical animals that are trying to make sense of multiple stories. And I think when it comes to the context of ministry, that's really why, or when you're drawn into having a faith and science conversation, is when someone says, well, science tells this story, or at least part of science or this scientific theory tells this story, but the Bible tells this story. How do I make sense of that? And I think one of the beautiful things about the biblical text is even inherently within it, it's not always all that, well, it's not modern. It's not really concerned with synthesizing all stories. That's not its objective. Like, we tend to want, this needs to all be coherent and make sense. And I think we're not that great of storytellers, and people from other times who are better storytellers or have a more dynamic sense of story allow multiple things to be at play in a story, and things that seem inconsistent actually to not be inconsistent. They're just reflect a surplus of story itself.
Right. I'm curious too if maybe you can speak to the other way around. Excuse me. I'm wondering if you can speak to the other way around. Like, is science a reliable source for some of the deeper meaning questions of life that we look to the Bible for. Because I know sometimes if I listen to, you mentioned Neil deGrasse Tyson, he can start to talk about the parts of the universe we still don't understand, and he sounds like downright biblical almost, or like he's writing a mystical psalm or something. And you can get a sense that there's a lot of people in the scientific camp that are kind of thought leaders in the space that almost look at science as a religion. Though they wouldn't use those terms, you can kind of get that from what they're saying. And I'm just wondering if you could speak to, do you think that that works as a worldview in and of itself? And do you think that lines up with what you see as the goal of science?
Yeah, I think there clearly are some, and it's really interesting. And I don't have all these studies in front of me right now, but it is interesting that people who are doing different scientific work tend to be more open to like larger, what we would call metaphysical questions than others. So for instance, like physicists and cosmologists there tends to be more kind of people who are theists in that camp, and the atheists are. It's ironic, you wouldn't think this, but in a lot of sciences, the science that has the most atheists in it are actually psychologists, which seems really interesting because it goes at this level. I mean, if you're kind of thinking about the expanse of the universe, you all of a sudden are thrown back into your smallness. And, when you think about how freaking huge, that's a scholarly phrase, how huge this universe is, that you quickly get thrust back into how utterly small you are, or how expansive time is. Like you do the cosmological calendar, the old Carl Sagan cosmological calendar, and you realize like conscious human existence, if you put the whole of the universe's existence onto a calendar, we've been here like 2 minutes. Like we're such a short time that you can't help but feel small, and then you're thrust into that smallness, and then you have an either or. That you either have to recognize, wow, there has to be some mystery out there that's beckoning to me, or we're so insignificant there's no meaning at all out there. And so that tends to lead some people to be theists, like, well, we're so small, there's got to be something. There's got to be something out there. Where it's interesting with psychologists is the really tricky thing, of course, about a certain kind of scientific atheism is if you just tell yourself all this is, and Neil deGrasse Tyson does this in one of the episodes of Cosmos, where basically all religion is false pattern recognition. That's all it is. Like, we are the kind of beings that have to create some kind of meaning. We have to look for purpose. And he's doing this around comets. Like, throughout human history, when there's been a comet, we have this all recorded across the globe that when people see a comet, they give meaning to it. It means there's going to be a drought. It means that a king's going to die. It means, earthquake's going to come. It means something. And his whole point is, well, we know exactly what it is now. It doesn't have any other bigger meaning to it. It's a mathematical reality, and we can actually trace it, and we can see it come again, and it's working off an orbit. But, this is what it means to be a human being, is that we look for patterns, and that allows us to be pretty good scientists, but it also allows us to do pretty silly things like look for God in a grilled cheese sandwich, or he insinuates, like, just create religions at all. Like, that just needs some kind of personal force to be doing something. So it becomes kind of an either or, that we are these kind of conscious beings who have to find meaning. And so you're kind of stuck with, well, we're the kind of conscious beings who have to find meaning, so we make all this stuff up, or we're the kind of conscious beings who have to seek for meaning because we're created in an image of a God who is a conscious relational being. And so I don't think science, and in some ways I don't think faith, can ever really solve, or I should say religion or institutionalized religions can ever solve the either or question, and that it really does become a question of faith. And I think one of the things we have to help our people understand is, if you claim, kind of with Neil deGrasse Tyson or Richard Dawkins, that listen, it's just false pattern recognition, listen, it's just the universe is so huge that you mean nothing, that's a faith claim too. Right. That's just as much as a faith claim too, and it may be a legitimate one. I mean, I don't want to minimize it. It may be a legitimate, up against the data, it may be a legitimate faith claim, but it is just as much a legitimate faith claim for me to claim, as a lot of physicists and cosmologists do, that actually we're so small, and yet these beings who can love and who can think and need meaning and can extend our consciousness, that, man, there's got to be something more. There's got to be a force. And those are empirical experiences too. I've prayed and I've seen God move in my life and bring transformation. So in faith too, I believe that there is a God who beckons me and gives me meaning and directs my life. That both of those are faith claims. And I think one of the things we should be careful of, and it gets back to your bad question thing, is we should be careful and not try to extinguish the either or try to solve it or be threatened by it. But I think we should be okay with it. Yeah, you're right. There is either an utter surplus of meaning here, of a God who is moving and doing things and calling us and created us in this unique way, or this is all just random. And you know what? Both have plausibility to them. And now we have to kind of look within our own experience, look within the histories of humanity, and ask our big questions and be willing to seek for answers to those and go where they lead us. I don't think we should be threatened by that. I think that should really open us up. And you know what? That was such a good question. I don't even remember what the original question was.
That was great. And one of the things from the book that I thought was really helpful for me is you kind of explained how for so many Christians or people in the faith community, because we're operating with such broad categories, we assume that embracing any sort of scientific finding is the same thing as embracing the ideology that everything is random and there is no meaning. And so you kind of pointed out how when people of faith become really defensive towards science, it's ultimately because of their inability to reconcile that with their idea of a personal God. And I'm curious if, just because I thought that was so helpful, if you can maybe elaborate on that a little more and then talk about how we begin to reconcile different scientific findings with the idea of a personal God.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an idea that I've been pretty convinced by with Charles Taylor, this is this Canadian philosopher who wrote this big book that I've been into for a number of years called The Secular Age. And it's a big book trying to answer just one question. You know, it's like it makes you want to vomit that he's just trying to answer one question. It takes him 750 pages to answer the one question. You think you've had long conversations on the phone with someone. I mean, this is unbelievable. But his one question is like, why in 1500? And he's just talking about kind of Western Europe and in those who are the legacy of kind of Western Europe, North America particularly, and saying like, why in 1500 was it nearly impossible for people not to believe in God in the West? And in a short 500 years later, it's not only possible now to not believe in God, it's much easier for people to not believe in God than to believe in God. And so he tries to answer that question. And one of the things he talks about is the move towards science and what science does. And this is just really informative to me. He says, the kind of perspective which you're pointing to here that happens sometime around the 19th century is this certain assertion, and it's been really picked up by these authors and TV personalities we've been talking about, that basically says, listen, if you are someone who needs to believe in a personal God, if you need that to function, well, that's fine. But for me, I've outgrown that. Like, I don't need that anymore. I've actually outgrown that. And so this becomes the position of maturity. Like, when you grow up, you'll throw off the cloak that's keeping you warm of religion and actually be a brave person. And Taylor's perspective, who's a deeply believing Catholic, says, you know what, that if the way that you were raised were in really kind of flat kind of religious education, really flat Christian formation, where all you were doing was coloring sheets and you were given really stupid answers about things, really simple answers, which I guess goes to the heart of your guys' podcast and why asking good questions is so important. If you were ever in in church life that you never asked good questions, then all of a sudden that makes a ton of sense. Like, oh my gosh, yeah, you're right. This is completely immature, and this is completely dumb. You're right. Wow, I feel so free to throw that off. But if you've actually, sat with your grandmother and watched her pray every night over your grandfather as he died of cancer, you all of a sudden, or been with a community that made it through kind of forms of oppression through prayer, and communities during the Civil Rights Movement, or in other countries who have found deep Christian practices as a way to deal with oppression and deal with things. All of a sudden, you can't see that as as immature. It becomes something much different than that. So I do think then the crux becomes is, can we be the kind of people who live and believe in a personal God? Is that possible? And to me, it does become a kind of either or question. But what becomes unavoidable is the fact that we're personal beings, and that we need these kind of personal relationships. So one of the ways I wrote the book was like through this story. I kind of wrote it as, it was in some ways it was a way just to keep the reader engaged in a science book, to not become too philosophical. But in another way, it was a kind of montage or homage, I should say, an homage to Galileo's writing. Who Galileo wrote things as like a dialogue between characters, which he made a very bad political misstep, because he put the Pope's negative kind of theory in the mouth of a character he called Simpleton, and that was not really a smart political move on Galileo's point, and got him into some hot water. So I tried to write it in a similar way as this kind of youth worker having these experiences, and one of the characters I wrote was this father who's a kind of engineer, physicist guy. And his basic point is that, that faith really is embedded in the realities of communities of people. And so what helped him come to believe was really this sense of praying with other people and having these personal encounters with other people. And for him, that opens up the possibility that the universe itself kind of points to this sense of otherness that calls for kind of personal encounter. And so I was trying to play with that idea, working a little bit more with kind of orthodox sources that John Zazoulis and others who kind of talk about the world even being constituted in this way of personal encounter and an encounter within it. And so I don't know if that's getting at your question actually, but that's where I would start.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. And I was wondering if maybe you could give an example with the theory of evolution, of like how would you approach that topic if someone were to say, hey, I am convinced by this scientific finding, but I'm struggling to figure out how I reconcile this with my belief and experience of a personal God. What would that conversation look like for you?
Yeah, I mean, for me, there'd be a couple elements that I would want to point out, and I mean, first of all, I would want to point out, I think there's just a ton, especially within the church, of just kind of historical illiteracy when it comes to science. Like we tend to think like Galileo was thrown in jail and beaten multiple times for saying that that the Earth revolved around the sun, and almost every kid in a youth group believes that. It's like, how many of you have heard this? They'll raise their hands, and it's just simply not true. That Galileo was never put in jail for saying this. He was put on house arrest in his villa outside of Florence, which probably saved his life from the plagues. But he was never beaten. He was never put in jail. He did get in some hot water. But the same is true with Darwin, that we tend to think of Darwin as, I guess my joke is I think of people tend to, in the church at least, to think of Darwin as the love child between like Hannibal Lecter and Darth Vader or something, And he's really not. I mean, here's a guy who was he failed out of medical school, who ends up at Cambridge and is studying for the ministry and is going to be a pastor. And basically, he spends his time looking for beetles, and then kind of has his breakthrough as he goes on the Beagle and has that experience. But Darwin never really thought of evolution as disproving faith. What led Darwin to never go to church again was not that he thought in the theory of evolution that God couldn't be there. As a matter of fact, Asa Gray, who was an American colleague of his who he wrote many of his letters to, was a strong believing Presbyterian, and he thought that evolution was exactly how God would create. And so telling that story is important. But the reason Darwin never went to church was not because of the theory of evolution. It was because his 9-year-old daughter died in his arms, and he just simply couldn't go back to church after the loss of Anna. So it was really this personal experience that was significant. So first of all, I'd want to tell people to look more deeply at Darwin's story, to see a human being there coming up with this, not someone who's rating against faith. But the second thing about evolution is that evolution does lead us with this conflict, like I mentioned earlier, that everything does die and mass extinctions are coming, and more things, more creatures, more insects, more mammals, more dinosaurs have are dead than ever lived before, or that are dead now than are dead than have ever lived. Like there's an incredible amount of extinction that's happened here. So that does lead us to a conflict of, well, does God care about these things? What does it mean for the future of humanity? But to me, the ultimate place that comes down that we never really tell people much about is to get to the kind of creatures that we are. That you have to have what these scientists say is a second, or sometimes they call it a third Big Bang. Like the movement from lower hominids to the kind of thinking hominids that we are is just remarkable jump. Like to move from every 10,000 years, the biggest advance is another quarter inch in a spear flint, to all of a sudden, bam, you get cave paintings, and then you get agriculture, and then you get royal monarchies, and then you get cathedrals, and then you get Netflix. Like this is an incredible jump. Like it's just an incredible jump. And so, up until right now, we really are the only animals who think about thinking. And so that, again, that leaves you with an either or. Either that was a really weird way for nature to just randomly go, or maybe there is some kind of vocation within the created realm that we are called to. And so I think theologically it is this question of what do we do with death. And for me, there's a big difference, and I follow Karl Barth on this, a big difference between death and dying. And I think part of the vocation of humanity, to be these hominids who think about thinking, that our job is to minister to all of creation as it dies, and even minister to one another. But once a certain form of sin and brokenness enters into the world, dying becomes a horrific nightmare called death that leads to isolation. But inherently, even if Adam and Eve had never sinned, I think we would still have dying, but maybe not death. Not the torture of death, but we'd still have dying. So in some ways, we could see sin as Adam and Eve, or to go with that kind of story, we could see Adam and Eve as refusing to be the ministers who stand with creation and help it into its process of dying. And once they refuse that vocation, death is cascaded throughout the created realm. And that gives a lot of significance to human beings. But again, we are these, until the aliens show up, man, we are these really weird animals who think about thinking. Like we know other animals have amazing intelligence. Like fish can remember things for a long time, and dolphins have language, and whales do incredible things. But none of them have created an iPhone. None of them have a library. This kind of sense of culture that we do, and it's really fascinating to think about human beings that, compared to like Neanderthals, we have smaller brains than Neanderthals, but our brains are much more fluid, and that we seem to actually offload a lot of the things we need to know onto the cloud, essentially, in what we would call it as culture. That we've created cultures that hold a lot of this information we need to know. And it appears that most, anthropologists don't think that like hominids had music or symbolic. They seem to bury their dead, but not symbolically. Like I said, they didn't have music. We don't think they had any kind of form of art. And it connects to another book I wrote called The Grace of Dogs, that they don't think that they had dogs or wolves that became dogs. And there's actually a theory from an anthropologist that thinks that what led us to win the kind of battle between hominids and Neanderthals in Europe, particularly during the Ice Age, that allowed humans, Homo sapiens, to kind of to survive, was that we found a way to domesticate wolves and they didn't, and that really did a lot for us. And so we're weird creatures. So I think when we think about evolution, that to be able to affirm that, yes, that we are animals, and that there's something that's threatening for some people in that, I don't think there should be anything threatening. But then to also say at the other hand that we are really weird, unique animals, and really strange animals, and that, I think that's an affirmation of faith. And so, but I do think it's unchristian to be animals, that we are fundamentally created beings, as the Nicene Creed says about Jesus, that he's true God of true God, begotten but not made. Well, we are not Jesus, and we are begotten and made creatures, and that's what makes Jesus, I think, so unique, at least in Nicene Christianity.
Yeah.
Yeah, and thanks for sharing that. I think one of the really cool things you just said, there was a lot, but something that jumped out at me was that there could be this idea of dying without death. Distinguishing between those two things is really cool. And jumping from that, I just wanted to share some experience I've had recently through series of events that I didn't even really think was a big deal. People have found out that I lean more on like theistic evolution side. I work at a church, and it caused just a little bit of a stir at the church that I work at. And it's caused me to have several conversations with people that, look at the Bible a little bit more literally in the creation narrative than I do. And that just had a lot of follow-up questions for me. And one of the main ones was actually that they perceive that the Bible says that death came as a result of the fall. And evolution obviously requires a whole lot of death, as you alluded to. And there's many, many other just biblical points that they come to that I have answered in those conversations. But I'm wondering from you, like, what's the best way or a better way from your perspective that we can interact with people that think something different than us, that can bring both sides of that together, and that can walk away like still brothers in Christ and sisters, still friends. We can still take communion together, like we could still be at the same church. We may not agree, but at least we have some respect, and not just like, well, you've crossed that line in the sand, so I can't talk to you anymore. How do you think we can do that and have better conversations regarding this topic?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it is amazing how much this conversation can be threatening to people, and I do think it's because exactly like you said, that if you go this route, then all of a sudden you undercut the Bible, and if you undercut the Bible, then you're not on my team, you're on another team, and then we enter into all sorts of kind of culture wars thing. I guess I would go back to what I was just kind of saying is that. To me, like something like Nicene Christianity and those kind of creedal statements are a very central thing. And so if we can, to me, I don't know how your listeners will feel about this, but to me, whether creation happened in billions of years or whether it happened in 7 days, it doesn't ultimately really matter. I think that really what matters for the centrality of faith is who we say this Jesus Christ is. And so once we get clear on who we confess this Jesus Christ is, then that just, to me, it all becomes a very periphery question. I know the response is, well, if you don't believe exactly what the Bible says at the beginning, then how can you trust what the Bible says later about Jesus? And then this whole thing falls apart. But I think that is to give the Bible too much weight as almost making it the fourth person of the Trinity, and that the Bible's job is to continually to testify to who this Jesus Christ is, but this Jesus Christ comes to us living, and this Jesus Christ comes to us in this community of prayer and confession. So I think one of the ways to do that, again, is for us to have to know each other's stories enough of why we trust in who this Jesus Christ is, and that our faith is embedded in our own encounter with Jesus Christ. I mean, it's really interesting that Orthodox Christians tend not to even say, like we do as Protestants, particularly, like the gospel. We believe the gospel, because they really see what the gospel is embedded in direct experiences, like Mary's experience, like John's experience, that the experience of the encounter of the living Christ is what gives faith. And so I think we have to be more focused on that we trust each other, that we know each other's stories about that encounter, and then we can really wrestle with these other questions. And that part of what it means to be a human being, and what's really exciting about it, is trying to answer the question of what is a lifetime and why do we live it? And how do we make sense of it? In which stories inform us? And I think we have to have a little bit more sensitivity with each other, a little bit more openness to allow people to give their best account on what they think what makes their life livable, or what gives them a sense of why they're here in the first place. But at the same time, I think in some ways social media has made us so sensitive to evaluate people, I think, that then we don't allow someone's best account to be given and be able to say to them, that's really interesting. but I don't buy it, and this is why I believe this, or this is the story that even a small story, maybe not the most formative story of my identity, is why I believe this, and so I think stories about origins to me are not essential as the stories about how have you had an encounter with this living Christ. But I do think that I think part of the importance for us here, which goes back to the question about personal encounter, is that I do think the Christian faith is embedded on us having a personal encounter with a living God who speaks, who moves, and but I don't think that precludes evolution, say. Like what you're saying about the biblical text, I mean, that I personally don't think you have to have a historical Adam and Eve, but Paul makes it really hard when Paul equates Jesus as the new humanity and Adam as the old humanity. That makes it much harder to be like, well, Adam and Eve stand for these certain hominids who came of consciousness that they could hear God actually speaking. And so I think we could beautifully say that God cared deeply about Neanderthals, but that these Homo sapiens who had extended consciousness had a particular vocation, and that vocation was to actually hear God speak and respond to God. And I think the early Genesis texts talk about walking in the cool of the garden with God and being in conversation with God. We are the animals, as the theologian Robert Jensen says, we're the praying animals. We're the animals who pray. And I don't know, maybe once we get to that, we can have a conversation, but we're not living in the golden age of discourse and conversation, unfortunately.
Yeah.
The conversation has kind of alluded this, but it seems that a lot of the problems with this conversation about science and faith or evolution in the Bible come back to our stories that we tell ourselves and like our overarching narratives. And it seems that a lot of people don't necessarily, from what they say, have a problem with science or evolution. They have a problem with taking God's word seriously, which is what I hear a lot. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, are there healthy ways to interpret or reinterpret specifically like the Genesis text in a way that is honoring God's word? Because I think a fear for a lot of people is, I don't want to start handling the Bible loosely and doing things recklessly. And so I'd love to hear your opinion on what are some ways that you can interpret the Old Testament or Genesis in a way that is honoring God's word and isn't being crazy or reading into the text and so forth like that.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think what I would say is that you honor the text and allow the text to even have authority in your life when you expect it to speak to you about who God is and how God acts. And that in many ways we need to read the text, but we also need the text to read our own lives. And so bringing our own experiences, our own stories, and asking the text to read our lives, I think is a much harder thing, but it's also a much more beautiful thing. So I think you have to actually go into the text and expect that God is going to speak to you through it. And what's ironic is a lot of people who need everything to be right, like every historical detail, every scientific idea, is that they actually come to the text to protect some kind of integrity of the text, not to see the text as this vehicle in which God speaks to us through. So I think it actually is a higher view of a living personal God to say, we're going to pick up this text, and for 2,000, 3,000 years, God has spoken to us through this text, and we're going to expect it to do the same. That's a quite different kind of assertion than we're going to pick up this text, and this text is everything it ever says is exactly right, and we're going to try to follow everything it says. No one can do that. I mean, when Jesus says, if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out, no one does that. I mean, everyone interprets that text in a certain way. But when that text is interpreted, I think beautifully, is when we read our lives next to it. What is it actually saying about how we live our lives? And so something has happened for the last 50, 60 years where we thought the litmus test is, do you believe everything in it, as opposed to you go to it expectantly for it to speak, for God to speak through it. And that becomes a very different kind of authority that you give to the text. And then I also just think that we've done a disservice with the text that we expect people to primarily read it alone as opposed to read it in communities of people. And that the Bible to me really first and foremost is a communal book that you read with people. But usually we give, fourth graders their Bibles at church and they're like, now take this home, read it every day by yourself. And then the exception is when they get to stand with a bunch of adults or a bunch of people across generations and read a text and try to articulate what it means to them or how it reads their own life, where it really should be flipped, where the more unusual thing is, you could hopefully do both, but the more unusual thing is that you read it by yourself, but you're always reading it with a community of people living very different kinds of lives, people from different ages, maybe people from different backgrounds. I think that's when the text kind of comes alive. So to me, I feel like I have a very high view of Scripture. I expect God to speak through it, but that doesn't mean that I have to assume that we had 7 24-hour days of creation. But I expect that story to tell me something more profound about how sinful I am, about how much I need a living God to come and speak to me, about the dignity of the created realm. And so I think another element maybe is to remember that there are multiple creation stories in the biblical text, and that it's not just the Genesis one. Because usually that's what people want to fight over or feel threatened by. But like Job has a creation story in it. It's a very kind of different creation story where God basically tells overinflated humanity that God cares about all sorts of weird crap. Basically that God takes Job on a cosmic adventure and shows Job all sorts of weird things. It's like, you see this weird bird? You like this weird bird? You know why this weird bird is here? Because I like it. God takes joy in this created realm. And so there's something beautiful about thinking about the multiple creation stories that exist there too, which it's been too much of a battle over Genesis and 7 days of creation or not, which seems like a really odd, weird thing. And like Augustine never read the text like that. Augustine never assumed to read the text like that. And so, like our church fathers read the biblical text in this very allegorical way because they were wanting the text, they were expecting the text to read their life. So they were allowing the text to read their life. So they read it not in this literal sense, but in this allegorical sense that brought them into this encounter, this eventful encounter with a living God. And to me, that's what the Christian faith is about, the eventful encounter with the living God who comes to us in the face of Jesus Christ.
Yep.
Now, the real question is, what does the church do with artificial intelligence?
Yeah.
Because that's coming up, and we need some answers.
Yeah, and it is so beyond my pay grade to have an answer for that. But that is the issue, and one of the things that's really at stake here is if we don't do what your podcast here is really recommending, which start jumping into difficult questions and helping people be able to wrestle with even big questions that don't have easy answers or maybe even any answer, that crap's going to happen, man. Things are going to happen out of Silicon Valley or out of China in some gene editing somewhere. And there are going to be big issues about what it means to be a human being, about all sorts of stuff. And, the church has not been beyond other times where we've had to stand up for really ethical situations and claim that we think that this violates what it means to be human. And that could be right around the corner. And so, my gosh, we will not be ready if people are for real big questions at stake about the future of humanity. If we're arguing about, well, was it 24 hours or was it more than that? Like, arguing about that will not allow us to be ready for Terminator or
I don't care about the answer to that.
So anyhow, and I guess that does go back to why I write the book about youth ministry, is that because young people, we need to save their faith, I guess, if you want to say it in that kind of lame way, by helping them deal with these questions. But there's big stuff coming up, and they need to be able to wrestle with them, and they're going to be big questions about.
You heard it here first. Our podcast will answer those questions. We will be leading the charge of artificial intelligence.
You need to find somebody more qualified, and that needs to be the next podcast. And what do you do with gene editing and artificial intelligence, and when all the dystopian movies become true?
Yep.
Well, hey, we really appreciate your time. I'd love to end by asking you this last question. What I feel like I've heard you saying is one of the ways we ask better questions when it comes to this topic is to start dealing with more specific categories and maybe ask, well, how does this specific finding relate to my faith in a personal God? And I'm curious, what's maybe an example of a scientific finding that for you personally just kind of blew your mind in regards to what it said about your faith in a personal God?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it echoes back what I've said before, like reading this paleoanthropology, like to me that is just shockingly mysterious stuff. I mean, thinking about what it would be like for this pod of hominids to all of a sudden start having extended consciousness and be able to dream and think extended thoughts. And I do happen to be a dog lover and did write this book called The Grace of Dogs, and thought about like dogs as our spiritual wingman or wingwoman who sits beside us and allowed human beings to both sleep late into the night, because to extend your consciousness you need to be able to get ample hours of sleep, and to have dogs sleeping next to you so that you could actually enter into REM sleep where you would actually have spiritual experiences. We have all sorts of spiritual experiences that happen through dreams in the biblical text and other places, that you would need to have some kind of ability to sleep through the night and not worry that some other beast was going to eat out your stomach. So to have dogs as these sentinel alarm systems, and then to sit in a field and be able to daydream and essentially to pray, and to have a dog sit next to you and essentially guard you while you do that. And we know all this stuff from these scientists who study animals, that if a predator is going to attack, but even a little chihuahua sees it, if it's called eye, that it will not attack. Like a tiger will not attack if it's been seen even by a much smaller predator, because it's all about the sneak. So you can imagine being able to daydream. So I just think there's a really interesting way of thinking about how people, and maybe with their dogs, this gets weird, right? But people with their dogs, but these people who started to actually have this extended consciousness as these created animals, that all of a sudden they could hear God speak. And I guess it's the either or again. We could just say they were delusional, and their minds allowed them to do great things, but they had to make up God so that they could deal with the fact that they were going to die. Or we could say, this created world is so beautiful and mysterious that eventually God created the conditions and actually ministered creation along, that these certain animals would come along who would pray and who would write and who would sing songs to this God and who would minister to the rest of creation as it died. So to me, that kind of evolutionary kind of thoughts are really interesting. So the paleoanthropology stuff is really interesting, and I guess that goes back to the question, contrasting paleoanthropology and really getting into that as opposed to just like reductionistic evolution is a very different kind of thing. Long answer to a good question.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thanks again. Before we let you go, we just want to give you an opportunity to tell people where they can find more about you and interact more with your work. And I'd love to also ask if you can throw in other resources people should check out if they want to learn more just about this topic in general.
Yeah. So if people want to find me, they can. I have a website that's just andrewroot.org. You can find me there. You can find this book, Exploding Stars, Dead Dinosaurs, and Zombies, which is the craziest title ever, but it's supposed to pique your interest, not just faith and science. So you can find that on Amazon. And I also have a book called Faith Formation in a Secular Age, and a new book called The Pastor in a Secular Age coming out in a few months. So you can check that out. You can find me on Twitter and things like that. And if you're looking for other resources, I'd point people to our grants website, which has a bunch of resources, videos you can use, articles. There's some videos that are directly related to this that are kind of animated, but also they're set up to allow for discussion and adult education and kind of youth ministry classes. And that website is scienceym.org. So you can definitely check that out. And then I would say, people should be reading someone like Polkinghorne and folks like that who have really been some good thinkers along these lines. So, yeah, it's been great to be with you. Thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was
awesome. Thank you.
hey, congrats. You just finished an episode of the Better Questions podcast. By rewarding yourself, you can subscribe and watch more, which is the best reward possible. So if you'd like to learn more, you can subscribe on our YouTube page, you can follow us on Facebook, you can join our Patreon page, and you can get more of this great content.
Don't forget about Instagram. We're on Instagram as well, at BetterQ Podcast.
Right. And if you have any complaints about the episode, you can email us at chrisnelson@gmail.com.
That's not my email, so it'll go to some other Chris Nelson who would be happy to hear your complaints.
Well, it was worth a try.
Thank you so much for watching and for listening, and we'll see you next time on the Better Questions Podcast.
Whatever the theme song is. What is that, Batman?
I'm keeping this in, guys.
It does sound a little like Batman.
Questions!
Yeah, we have a full episode where we just try and remember our theme song, because none of us can. Oh.